Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In today's first segment of this episode, we're going to discuss a report that says a top U.S. official has declared that Washington is in talks with the Houthis of Yemen to end the war in that country. Now, this is the first such contact in approximately 4 years. We did have the former Obama administration of the United States, which briefly had held talks with Houthi leaders to try to convince them to negotiate a peaceful settlement to the situation there in Yemen. Those talks and the subsequent UN-sponsored talks also failed. We can go through, obviously, a list of those sorts of efforts around 2015 or so. And now we have this movement by the U.S., by the Trump administration, to try to seemingly bring some sort of a resolution to the situation in Yemen. Will it work? What are the obstacles in the path, and why now? Is this, again, more about domestic U.S. consumption, or is this actually an effort to bring peace to Yemen? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Abdulaziz Al-Ghashian, who is a political analyst. He's also with Essex University. He researches Saudi foreign policy. He's joining us now from Essex itself. And we're also joined by Hamid Al-Shejni, who is an Arab affairs expert. He's an academic expert in Arab affairs. He's joining us now from Oxford. Abdulaziz and Hamid, thank you both for your time this morning. Hamid, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this latest effort by the U.S. to get involved in trying to resolve the situation in Yemen? How is this different from Obama's such effort? Will it work?
I think what's happening at the time being it's just for domestic consumption, just to show that the President of the United States administration is keen to have peace in Yemen. However, on the ground, you can see they are doing the opposite. We have created, along with the Arab Emirates, a new militant in the south to divide the country and to fraction it into small parts. What has happened from the beginning, if there have been any sincerity to solve the issue, they say initially that they liberate 80% of Yemen. Yet the legitimate government that's recognized by the international community and by the United Nations are not able to go back to this 80% of the liberated part of Yemen and establish the government of law and prosperity. They have been prevented, and they create a new militant. Now the administration to claim that they are in talk with the Houthi. Yes, the administration and the United States has been supporting the Houthi behind the scene, and there are a lot of evidence to support this. Among them, the Houthi was fighting in the ground. The militant was fighting in the ground in Al-Bayda, for example, and the drone and the United States drone and other missiles was supporting them from the sky. It's also a fact that when the Houthi invade Yemen, the cities in Yemen, starting from Sa'da all the way to Aden, the United States was supporting them, and they were asking the legitimate government, which is represented by Abdurrabbu Hadi Mansour, not to interfere. And
but Hamid, to be fair, that's quite a different narrative. The picture you're painting is quite different, comes out, because it seems the U.S. is very much on the side of the coalition when it comes to this issue of Houthis, isn't it? I mean, the U.S., at least publicly, from what I've understood, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but public statements by the U.S. have all been against the Houthis, saying that they're Iranian-backed, et cetera, et cetera.
You see that the United States created Al-Houthi as an image and as an enemy to buy weapons, okay? And they were supporting them by refueling the airplane and stuff like that. But if you look at the target, how many Houthis has been killed for the last 5 years? You could see almost none. Okay, all the targets has been the infrastructure of Yemen. It has been wedding. It has been many tragedies that has happened, but the Houthis hasn't been targeted. And if someone like you and many will be surprised when I say this thing, but if you remember in the Iraq war between Iraq and Iran, do you remember the Iran Gate, when the United States was supposed to be supporting Iraq, and give them weapons and support its allies in the region? Yet it was discovered that they were selling weapons also to Iran, and they were giving them support.
Okay, so Hamid, I just wanted to bring Abdulaziz into the conversation. Abdulaziz, make of what Hamid there said, and what do you also then make of the question that I'd put to him about prospects for this to succeed where Obama, for example, didn't succeed?
Well, thank you very much for having me again, and greetings to you and all your guests. Well, I very much am speculative about what the gentleman has mentioned about the United States backing of the Houthi rebels. I too find it very hard to understand that there are there is this very strong support for the Houthi rebels behind the scenes. Although I'm not surprised that there might be a reason why the support by the United States, or maybe there's this acquiescence by the United States. But there is a history of the United States supporting both sides and having a dual kind of relationship. I think it should not be confused with the current situation with the Houthi rebels. Now, what I find very fascinating, though, is that the Houthi rebels are the ones who are reproaching the United States a lot more than the United States reproaching the Houthi rebels. And I find this very astonishing because let us remind ourselves of the constant chants they say on the streets: death to America and death to Israel, and God curse the Jews. This is the kind of chant that they say, yet I find it very astonishing that they are the ones that are acting very proudly.
So then I wonder, Abdulaziz, if I may come in, I wonder then, if the issue that there's this external player, i.e. the United States, which is in the midst of all this, hands, feet in, behind the scenes, possibly a whole bunch of murky conversations possibly taking place, why doesn't the region just then take power of the situation, take the situation forward and try to resolve it itself? Why not just have Yemenis, including the Houthis, around the table with the Saudis, the Emiratis, and everybody else, and come to a resolution where it's regional-led, not U.S.-led?
This is a very good question, and I think what you are actually describing is the current situation, the current intention. Now, the whole notion of the war is really not just an expulsion or a suppression of the Houthi rebels. What the intention of the Arab coalition is to provide a political solution. That is the intention of it. Now, maybe people can criticize the way the coalition is going about it. This is a different thing. But the intention behind it is to force a political solution so that the Houthi rebels can be part of the political game and the political atmosphere or the political policy making within Yemen. Now, this is the whole conundrum. This is the whole situation and impasse, is that some people don't want the Houthi rebels to be within Yemen, to be part of the political game. The Houthi rebels themselves want to have a monopoly over the political situation in Yemen. Moreover, you've just mentioned something very different. Or you mentioned something very, very crucial, which is the regional situation that are taking control. I think this is the crux of the problem, because it is precisely the regional issues and the regional power players, i.e. also Iran, that is trying to keep a foothold within Yemen as well. And this is what's creating this impasse.
Okay, so if I may come in, Abdulaziz, because on that point, I'm glad you brought up Iran, in fact. Hamid, I want you, because, we talk a lot about the disagreements that this region has, be it between Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it does seem, doesn't it, Hamid, that when it comes to even the toughest of issues, and I can go back to those talks that a UAE official, I believe it was a Navy official, if I'm not mistaken, had with an Iranian Navy official. This was, of course, about the issues surrounding the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, et cetera. And some sort of a rough, overall understanding was reached during those discussions. And we can imagine, obviously, there were tough discussions. It wasn't easy to come to some sort of an understanding, but shouldn't it be regional-led always when it comes to resolving this region's issues? We should not be encouraging external players like the U.S. to be at the helm.
We hope, that those regions, to start with, are independent, okay? But I don't think that they have their own, they make their own decision. The decision is made usually outside, which is mostly in UK or the United States, okay? And what I am saying in here, to be specific, the war in Yemen is not to have all the parties solve the issue and have a political movement and so on and so forth. The alliance, for example, what's called the alliance, which is by the Yemeni considered as the enemies of Yemen, okay? What they have been doing initially, they have worked with the Houthi to invade all the Yemeni cities, okay? And they supported them. Iran, yes, created the Houthis and still supporting them, but initially Saudi Arabia and UAE and support the Houthi until they invade most of Yemen. Then the United States turn around and say, no, they are now making a threat, and at that time they were hoping that they're gonna fight with the Muslim brother. And they're gonna wipe all those what they call Al-Qaeda and Daesh, despite the fact that Daesh doesn't exist in Yemen. And what the Houthi has been claiming when they were invading other cities. Then the United States say it is now the Iranian extension in Yemen, the Iranian involvement in Yemen. You have to be fighting it, and the Saudis and the UAE fall into this issue, and they start buying weapons and create what's called the alliance. However, if there is a sincerity to solve the issue, either by the United States, the regional force, why they create a new militants in the south? Okay. Wouldn't it logically make sense that you have a legitimate government that you yourself claim to come to reinstall? Why don't you bring it to the 80% of the liberated part of Yemen and have a strong army and unite all the Yemenis behind to get rid of the Houthis, if that's the claim that they are a threat.
We are actually going over time, but Abdulaziz, take permission from producer and just get your final word in on this in under a minute if you can, Abdulaziz. What are your thoughts, in fact, about what is happening in South Yemen? Because that is a huge issue, obviously, and that has an effect, certainly, on how the situation develops further vis-a-vis any sort of peace talks, too.
Yeah, I understand, and I will be as concise as possible. I would like to, firstly, the south of Yemen. This is the situation in south of Yemen in the South Transitional Council, the SDC. This is a result of the complexities and the complex history of Yemen. And I think this is why I humbly and respectfully disagree with the honorable guest, because I think the establishment of the Houthi rebels and so on has not been in the hands of the United States. It's actually been in the result of a failed state under Ali Abdullah Saleh. The Houthi rebels is not a new phenomenon. It's been going on. It's been there for years, especially in the early 90s, and it's the result of a failed state. Now, the reason why it is very difficult to try to get them out or to force them into a position or to, as the gentleman said, get the other 20%. Because this is the nature of this unconventional and conventional warfare. There's a tremendous amount of complexity here, and the fact that the Houthi rebels and Iran are a result of a failed state under Ali Abdullah Saleh. This is the reason why this allowed and paved the way for such a complexity, for such a phenomenon that we see in the Houthi rebels. And this is why I also have one more thing to say.
Sure, just very quickly if you can. Yep.
That very quickly, there is the gentleman is over exaggerating, in my opinion, the role of the United States and the Western powers in the decision making of the regional players in the region. I don't think that all the decisions are made in the United States or the UK. I don't think they even have all the decisions made for their own countries, let alone the region in Saudi Arabia or let alone the Gulf. Because if you could just see Brexit, I don't think they have their own issues sorted. So let alone a complex situation that we see in Saudi Arabia, Yemen,
and that's
Iran,
a very good point to conclude on, Abdulaziz. I will thank you, and I do apologize, of course, we both off. I just wanted to get the conversation flowing, but we sincerely appreciate both Abdulaziz and Hamid for their time and, of course, their insight. Certainly, as both of our guests are mentioned, viewers, a complex issue in Yemen. A lot of players have their hands in this pie, and that makes it all the more hard to then see a solution on the horizon, because now we have added to all of this a secessionist movement once again in South Yemen. And different external players have different interests, certainly, when it comes to the issue of Yemen. How will this move going forward? Will U.S. involvement vis-a-vis talks be any different or be any more successful this time around? Because as I had put to you, the UN and Obama's administration, the past Obama administration, I should say, in the U.S., have put an effort in that regard in the past, and that has not worked. We'll keep a very close eye on that situation there in Yemen and see if any sort of peace talks do actually come to fruition through these efforts of the U.S. and others. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment of the show, we're going to discuss San Francisco. It's a number of its politicians, I believe, have gotten together and have declared and labeled formally the National Rifle Association, the NRA, a domestic terrorist organization. This follows a shooting attack, which, as you remember, took place at the Gilroy Garlic Festival there south of that city, which killed approximately 3 people back in July. The resolution says the U.S. is, quote, plagued by an epidemic of gun violence, and then goes on to accuse the NRA of using its considerable wealth and organization strength to promote gun ownership and incite gun owners to acts of violence. Now, it's not just San Francisco which has acted vis-a-vis gun violence. Even the Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick of Texas, has publicly now endorsed expanding that state's background checks to private gun sales from Friday onwards, defying the NRA. And the NRA has not obviously reacted happily to any of the above, saying that this is not the solution, that guns don't kill people, people kill people. I'm paraphrasing, of course, what they've said this time around, but those are the statements they've made in the past. Let's discuss that a bit further now. We're now joined by Dr. Rashawn Ray, who is a sociologist. He's a Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings Institution. He's joining us now from Washington, D.C. Rashawn, good morning, and thanks for joining us here in Scope. What do you make of San Francisco's labeling of the NRA a domestic terrorist organization? It's gotten a lot of heat for that, even on the side of those who do want more stringent checks on those purchasing guns.
Yes, well, thank you for having me on the show. Yes, I think what San Francisco is doing is they definitely are trying to send a message, and they're trying to send a message that even if individuals don't necessarily have their fingers on the trigger of a weapon, if they have provided and allowed for that weapon to actually be used in ways that cause harm, particularly when they have the ability to actually reduce or decrease the likelihood of someone using a weapon, then they are in some ways responsible. I tend to think that it's not just the National Rifle Association, but also the politicians who are literally troublesome bedfellows with the NRA in regards to allowing for individuals to have the ability to go out and exercise certain types of violence on other people when they actually have research and when they actually have information that will reduce the shootings that actually occur in the United States.
But then, you know the argument, Rashawn, about the Second Amendment and the right to own firearms and to be able to defend yourself, et cetera, et cetera. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that trying to restrict someone's ability to have a gun is quite different from aiming to keep individuals safe. And I'll be very specific about this. I am a native Tennessean. I am from Tennessee. I grew up around guns. My grandfather was a drill sergeant in the U.S. Army for over 20 years, Purple Heart, Bronze Star. He had well over 10 guns, probably 15 guns in our house. And they were kept lock and key. Growing up around guns is one of the rites of passage that children learn how to use a weapon. Currently, of course, living in the D.C. area, this is quite different. I have a lot of students at the University of Maryland who have never seen a gun, who have never held a gun, and who have definitely never shot a gun. So I really understand the various politics and the differences in cultures as it relates to guns. I've also spent 2 years living in California when I was at UC Berkeley. So I have a very good idea of the different ways and the different platforms that people has as it relates to guns. But again, having the Second Amendment is very different from actually saying that we need to do things like reduce the likelihood that someone can go up in a school with a firearm, reduce the likelihood that someone can cross state lines and purchase a gun and then go back across state lines and wreak havoc upon hundreds of people. And we've seen these particular incidents, asking for more stringent background checks, asking for a national registry, asking for an incubator period, which is the time period in which an individual will purchase a weapon, and then the time period in which they will be given a weapon, say 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours later, would end up decreasing a lot of the mass shootings that we see in the United States.
You know, I wonder what of the argument that you'd well know about, of course, Rashawn, about the NRA saying it's not guns that kill people, it's people that kill people. And, you know, it goes back to, be it mental health issues, personal problems. There are a variety of reasons, obviously, that anyone would act out in a violent fashion, either using guns or otherwise. What do you think is the root cause? Are we, or many people, I shouldn't say, should say, that when they blame guns as the root problem here, are they overstating things? Should it be actually going back to society's problems with mental health and family breakdown, for example, et cetera?
So I think it's a couple of things going on as it relates to some of the root causes of gun violence. First, guns do actually kill people. Like, guns are very lethal weapons. They are pretty much some of the most lethal weapons that we have on the planet. Accordingly, what that means is that we can compare the United States to other countries around the world, whether that be the UK, Australia, India, and the like. And part of what's important here is that in other countries, they have much more restrictive rights to guns. And you know what? They don't have nearly as many mass shootings as the United States does. I actually think one of the best comparisons is Australia, who around the time that Columbine happened, roughly 20 years ago or so, Australia also had a mass shooting. And they went in a very different direction than the United States did. The United States went in the direction that a good guy with a gun can protect against bad people with a gun. And again, to people who say that guns don't kill people, well, why would you need a good guy with a gun to actually do something against a bad guy with a gun? But the point is, Australia went in a different direction, and they started making their gun laws much more restrictive. And they haven't hardly seen any mass shootings in the past couple of decades relative to the United States. So I think that's the first thing, that unfortunately guns do hurt people. I think on the other side, though, is that oftentimes people blame, and in this regard, we're going to talk about social and structural factors, as sociologists would say. Yeah. On the social side, people oftentimes blame mental health. While there may be some issues as it relates to mental health, there are a lot of people who have mental health conditions who would never go out and wreak havoc as it relates to mass violence and mass shootings. There's another unfortunate factor that plays a role in this. Oftentimes it deals with masculinity, and then it also deals with whiteness in the United States. And so as it relates to mass shootings, about 75% of mass shootings in the United States are committed by people who oftentimes have very masculine, hegemonically masculine approaches to life, and who are also oftentimes embedded in nationalist culture, extremist types of culture, particularly in the United States as this relates to white supremacy.
Yeah, so I'm just going to conclude this part, Rashawn, because I know you're going to be staying with us for our next segment too, but just for our viewers' sake, Rashawn there was able to put all of this into context for us. Obviously, it's more complex than just what, especially those of us outside the U.S., view this issue as. It's not just black and white. There is some gray area here. The NRA obviously has not reacted very well to the San Francisco city labeling it a domestic terrorist organization. There is some irony there because obviously many minorities, especially Muslims, would probably see this as a double standard about why there would be such hype over the NRA being declared a domestic terrorist organization and so many people being very negative about that versus, for example, a Muslim who carries out an act of violence that obviously is not justified on any level, but then being labeled a terrorist immediately. What then is terrorism? And that we weren't able to talk about, obviously, with Rashawn, but those are one of the major factors as well that probably plays some role in this. But certainly, as Rashawn said, the root factors, as spoken about sometimes in the media, i.e. mental health and society's problems, et cetera, do not, again, justify the fact that there are simply too many guns in too many people's hands who probably should not really have them in their hands, be it because of their mental health stability or instability, I should say, or otherwise, and even maybe their ideological leanings, be it white supremacy, white nationalism, however we want to term it. So a more complex issue than just what appears on the outside, and certainly something that needs to be discussed at more depth, so that the rest of us outside can understand, and so that policymakers in the U.S. can make better decisions vis-a-vis how to deal with the gun violence that continues to be increasing throughout that country. I'll be back with our next segment, though, after this break. Welcome back, viewers. In this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the black-white wealth gap in the United States. Now, this is a topic which comes up often in discussions, especially domestically within the United States. And it's complex in the sense that when we're talking about solutions and how exactly to bridge this gap, it seems that no one can really agree on that. But the facts, as put forth in a latest report by the global consultancy firm McKinsey and Company, says that it will cost the U.S. economy as much as $1 trillion between now and 2028 to maintain this black-white racial wealth gap. That's a huge number, certainly, for any country, and that it says that, in fact, eradicating the wealth gap would add $1 trillion+ to the nation's economy by 2028, which would certainly be a win for everybody involved. Now, as far as the root causes of all this goes, the report is quite straightforward about this as well, saying that this goes back to the years of slavery, where white families were able to then gain land, et cetera, and wealth of all sorts. But then in the ensuing years, that gap has seemingly only actually grown, even though, admittedly, African Americans have been gaining wealth through the country. How does one approach this? What does a logical approach to all of this look like? Is it reparations, as some people would speak of? Let's put that to our panelists now. We're still joined by Rashawn Ray, who is a sociologist, as I had said, Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings Institution. He's still with us from Washington, D.C. We're also adding a new voice. We're joined now by John Kane, who's a professor at the School of Government and International Relations at Griffith University. He's joining us now from Queensland in Australia. John and Rashawn, thank you for your time. John, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this sort of racial wealth gap? It's certainly not just limited, I imagine, to the U.S., but how does one bridge it? What are the root causes, do you think?
I have no idea how one bridges it. No, I don't even know how McKinsey and Co. plan to spend $1 trillion just to maintain the gap as it is. What policies that involves, I'm not at all sure. Of course, the reparations arguments are going on, but it's very hard to see that ever politically getting very far. And even if it did, how that reparations would be managed to close the gap that is there, and as you point out, has been there for since the Civil War and later. And you're right, of course, this is not just an American problem, but it is a specific problem for African Americans, indeed.
Okay, so Rashawn, what are your thoughts on that? How does one go about dealing with this situation? Is it, as the report puts and other reports have put, back to the slavery era, for example?
Yeah. So part of it is, as you mentioned, understanding the root causes. So yes, slavery is a big part of why the gap exists, but it's also then the land that slave owners had. And then it's the fact that individuals who didn't own land, and being more specific, whites who didn't own land, were able to take advantage of the Homestead Act. If people aren't familiar with that, they should look that up. What that allowed for individuals to do, essentially, it was like Wild Wild West movies in America, where people would head out west and could literally claim land oftentimes that had already been allocated to Native Americans and other groups. Part of what people have to also understand is that once slavery ended, African Americans were actually originally given reparations. And what I mean by this, on paper, that they were supposed to get 40 acres and a mule, that actually never came to fruition. In the United States, America has a history of giving out reparations to Jews from the Holocaust, from Native Americans as it relates to the Trail of Tears as we know it to exist, from Japanese internment from World War II. African Americans continue to be the only group that has been systematically disenfranchised by the U.S. government who have not received reparations, a repair for past wrongs. And part of the gap continuing to exist is the fact that a lot of the social programs that exist to actually what the report was saying to maintain this gap is going to continue to proliferate. So it would actually cost the United States potentially less money to actually put forth a reparations package than it would be to maintain the status quo. And part of this reparations package could look like a series of things. But some of the things that have been touted include baby bonds for children who are born, student loan forgiveness for individuals who went to college, and also down payment grants for homes in neighborhoods that have been systematically disenfranchised by redlining and restrictive covenants, and essentially housing segregation that continues to highlight the ways that the racial wealth gap exists in the United States.
John, I wonder, and I'm going to ask you this do you believe that there is systemic racism, that this is racism that is embedded within the system still, all these years after the civil rights movement?
Absolutely. It's never, the Civil War in a way has never ended. And racism is endemic in America. I mean, the current president and all the rather nasty currents that have been flowing under his guardianship are kind of telling in the way that they're releasing things that have always been there in American society, but more or less concealed or semi-concealed, or at least politely spoken about, whereas now it's sort of flooding out in the open. It looks very ugly, but this strain has always been there. And if you're being black in America, black in America is just a different thing from being almost anything else in America. I'd like to know, as a practical matter, how reparations are going to work. I see that Elizabeth Warren has a plan to raise $500 billion for housing for poor people, which will be concentrated in African-American people probably, to give them cheap housing, ready housing, and to try to fix the issue that my other interlocutor is speaking about. That has to get through political system, through Congress, which seems to me highly problematic. And even then, I mean, I'm a little bit pessimistic. We have in Australia too, we have a closing problem too. Here, our closing the gap is always about Indigenous people. Yeah. They always come bottom of every social measure that you want to, and year after year after year, and millions of dollars are actually spent on this, by billions of dollars by successive governments, but the gap remains, and it's very frustrating. It takes generations. I was reading, my other interlocutor there is a sociologist, I believe, and I was reading Neil Groff, the sociologist, in the New York Times a few weeks ago, and he was talking about all the Democrats talking about structural change. And he says, as a sociologist, we know structural change is very, very hard to accomplish. It can happen. It does happen. But it takes violent events, or it takes generations and decades, and the policies to do it. And I'm not sure anyone's really got a handle on the policies that can accomplish that. I wish it was so.
All right, so Rashawn, I'm going to put to you an argument, which, again, I'm sure you've heard before when it comes to this issue, and everyone points to the Obama administration and Barack Obama's presidency to begin with as proof that African Americans are not sidelined in the United States, and that an African American can be president of the United States even. Why then are we still then talking about this, is what many people would say.
Yeah, well, I mean, as we just heard, the points laid out were extremely important about the ways that structural racism is embedded in our social institutions. And part of what that means is that an individual racist need not exist for racism to continue. And part of this is because it's embedded in our laws, it's embedded in our neighborhoods, it's embedded in our school systems, it's embedded in our political system. President Obama becoming the first African-American identifying president, and particularly as it relates to that symbolic victory for race, doesn't necessarily mean that racism went away. In fact, racism actually reared its ugly head even more because individuals were aiming to fight against that. And I think a Trump presidency essentially highlights that. I think part of the other thing that people have to realize about the gap that exists is that about 50% of people's wealth is tied up in home ownership. African Americans have been restricted systematically in a discriminatory fashion from being able to obtain home loans in the same way as whites. That happened historically, and that's happening currently. In fact, the Department of Justice and other U.S. government agencies actually sued the large banks in the United States, from Chase to Wells Fargo to Bank of America, for predatory lending. In other words, they weren't giving African Americans an equal home loan relative to their metrics, their credit score, how much money they were going to put down, their income relative to whites. So I think part of what people have to realize is that, unfortunately, racism continues to exist in America. And if we really want to deal with it, we have to engage in structural and honestly a more radical type of policy. So Elizabeth Warren, for example, with student loan forgiveness, this was a report written by several colleagues, in particular, Dr. Louise Singster, who is a sociologist at the University of Iowa. We also have Kamala Harris saying that we're going to give down payment grants for people who live in neighborhoods that have been systematically redlined. And what that means when we say redlining, we have to be very clear for people to understand that. What redlining means is that someone literally essentially took a red line and drew a line and said, we are not going to invest in these particular communities. We aren't going to build banks. We aren't going to build grocery stores. We aren't going to build new development. And these neighborhoods have historically been African American. And unfortunately, neighborhoods today are just as segregated, if not more segregated, than they were in 1980. So I think the assumption is that when we talk about racial progress, that things progress, and instead we actually can see a regress.
Okay, so Rashawn, I'm going to put you on the spot just for a moment. I wonder what your personal experience, and I'm not asking you for personal details, obviously, that you would not be comfortable giving out, but just in your personal experience, how has the fact that you are a person of color, how has that affected your life so far? I mean, you're an accomplished man, certainly, in any regard. So, but just do you feel that the fact that you are a person of color in the United States has in some way held you back?
So I'll put it this way. Oftentimes the question that you pose is oftentimes about feelings or perceptions. And it's nothing that a person necessarily feels or perceives. These are real life type of incidents that occur on a regular basis, where, as the report laid out, individuals are oftentimes restricted from network access. And when you're restricted from network access, you are restricted from opportunity. Yes, similar to President Obama, people hold him up as saying this is an example of why racism doesn't exist. There are a lot of people who would view me the same way. I have a PhD. I have a great job. I live in a great neighborhood. I have a great family. People would say, oh, look, Rashawn is an example of racial progress. But see, this is the problem. The system is set up always for a few people, whether they be minorities or women, a few individuals to squeeze through. This is the key question people have to ask themselves, is that what about a person who we just consider to be average, who doesn't have a PhD, who doesn't work at a major university? What does their life outcomes look like? And I have a lot of family members and a lot of friends whose lives are very different from mine, not because of necessarily different decisions that we've made, but it's simply because of the fact that in America, in order to actually be extremely successful, if you're a minority or if you're a woman, oftentimes you have to be exceptional in a lot of ways. I think we'll reach true equality when a Black person can be average and still be successful.
Okay, so John, I'm going to give you the final word. John, there's a lot of people on the other side of the aisle who would argue that, listen, all this talk about racism towards African Americans has been exaggerated, and that in fact a lot of this can then go into reverse racism against, in fact, Caucasians and the white people. Do you feel that as well? What are your thoughts about that?
I agree with Rashad, everything Rashad says about he's really still talking about the structural nature of racism. Individuals will get through, but the structures remain. And it's not just the fact that the structures remain, is there are people in place who don't want the structures to change. And they're across the aisle there. There are people who actively work against keeping things as they are. And most of them, unfortunately, are in the Republican Party. And the Republican Party has kind of shown its true colors under Donald Trump and somewhat before that, really since the Nixon era and the move to Southern strategy and so forth. There's a sometimes thinly veiled, but often increasingly visible racism, but not an active racism. People are trying to prevent this from happening, and they don't want it to happen. They don't want the structure to change and blacks to be equal with whites. This racism goes very, very deep in many American souls. One thing I will say in conclusion that, you think about any movement, the women's movement, the social civil rights movement in the 1960s, it required, to get any change at all, it requires political mobilization on a large scale. And I guess if there's any hopeful signs in America at the moment, is something is happening, perhaps in reaction to the Trump presidency and so forth, the disappointment perhaps of the Obama presidency, but there is some feeling that something is happening in American society generally, which may be hopeful for mobilization towards progress.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final word, but of course we appreciate John and Rashawn for their time today and of course for their expert insight on this topic. Certainly it's important, viewers, as I had put to both of our guests, to speak about the root causes of why this black-white racial wealth gap even exists to begin with. And of course, it does go back to slavery, the era of slavery, and laws that were put in place even right after, and laws already in place even right now, which do discriminate against the African-American citizens of the United States. And it's not, in fact, just limited to citizens of the United States. I mean, there is much talk about people of color around the world, and specifically in the Western world, who are discriminated against on a regular basis. We can even talk about, in fact, examples within Canada, and I imagine possibly within Australia, and certainly within the UK as well, about police brutality specifically towards African Americans. All of that plays into this sense of racial inequality when it comes to wealth as well, because the opportunities are not actually equal. The schools in neighborhoods which are majority African American and people of color are not as good as those in white neighborhoods. Many other social services are not as good quality as those, again, in white neighborhoods. So that gives a child or any African American or person of color a disadvantage from day one. Does that mean somebody still cannot succeed? No. But nevertheless, it remains a generational issue then. Generation after generation after generation is growing up with disadvantages. And that seems to be the main issue that needs to be resolved at this time. We'll certainly keep a very close eye on that situation, because this is a topic we've only just touched the tip of the iceberg, I should say. But we'll certainly keep an eye on that, as I said, and we'll discuss that later on here in Scope as well in great detail. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.